Well, we start in Europe this afternoon where the leaders of Germany and France have been meeting today amid other meetings to discuss the situation on the border between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has over 100,000 soldiers on its border. In the last few days, the US has said there will be repercussions if Russia invades Ukraine. Britain has claimed it believes Moscow is trying to install a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine. In 2014, Russia used military force to take the Crimea from Ukraine. Professor Robert Schrire is an emeritus professor at the Department of Political Studies at UCT. He joins us now. Professor Schrire, good afternoon to you. The tension seems to really be building between Russia and Nato countries. Is it possible to know how this is going to turn out?
Well, if we had an answer to that question, we could probably sell it to the hedge funds for many millions of dollars. Nobody actually knows, and I'm quite frankly not entirely sure if Putin himself knows how he's going to react. All the pieces of the puzzle are sort of mixed up, and you can put them together in many different ways. Probably the American view at the moment is that this is a prelude to an invasion of the Ukraine. But it's interesting that in the Ukraine itself, the government seemed to regard this as, I won't say much fuss about nothing, but as an exaggerated response to a Russian threat which has been present for the last 7 years at least.
I suppose the key question really boils down to, would Putin do it? If he did it, would Ukraine be able to stop him? I know that they've improved their army over the last few years, but Russia is Russia. It's got a massive army.
Correct. You know, to quote President Medvedev, Russia is a junk economy with a big military. And it's very interesting that very recently, in the last few days, South Korea overtook Russia as a larger economy. So I think that does put it into context, that Russia is a small power with a big military capability. And of course they are using it, and we can argue whether it serves Russian interests or not. But the key factor here is, what does Putin want? And I think, quite strongly, having been to Ukraine and Russia moderately recently, that Putin is using the Ukraine as a bargaining chip to get some of the things that he lost with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In specific terms, I don't believe that Putin wants to territorially annex any part of the Ukraine. So it's a bargaining chip. He's already indicated what he wants. He wants NATO to stop expanding. He wants the end to intermediate range ballistic missiles in Europe. He wants no more bases and so on. So he's basically stated what he wants. Bottom line is, there's no way that a small power like Russia can dictate to the US or the EU what it wants them to do, other than to make a threat of military incursions. And I think the dilemma for Putin, as I see it, and I have to be frank with you and your listeners, I don't share a very widespread view that Putin is a brilliant strategist and master tactician and so on. I think he's rather a clumsy manipulator of realpolitik, because he's got himself into a position where he has threatened the big stick if he doesn't get his way. I think it's quite clear that he's not going to get his way. Biden, the European Union, although they're not entirely united, are not going to give him a guarantee that NATO will not expand. The irony, of course, is much of this is unnecessary. The Ukraine is not going to become a member of NATO, and we all know that. But Putin wants a written guarantee. So he's not going to get many or any of his demands met, which puts the pressure on him to do something. And I think he's going to find that military action is going to be very unsatisfactory and counterproductive. Because, first of all, it would be a very messy business to conquer the Ukraine, and I don't think he wants to pay the cost. But secondly, as we know from Afghanistan and Vietnam, once you've conquered the Ukraine, if such could be possible, you're then stuck with a very unhappy population. So he's using the big stick as a bargaining tool, and that leads to other questions like, why now? Why is he now suddenly becoming aggressive when the factors that have disturbed him have been in place really since the end of the Cold War, 2005, 2010, and so on?
There's also an issue where NATO is an alliance, so it's a group of countries. They all have to agree on a common position. I must accept, and I don't know if you do, but the United States plays, I think, probably the leading role in NATO still. But then Russia is just one country. So does that make it possible for Putin or the people around him to try and seek division, try and stoke division within NATO? Does that actually make it harder for NATO than it is for Russia at all?
Well, I think the important question, of course, you're right, is, as they say in America, who has the most skin in the game? And the reality is that America is not a vital participant in European politics. This is the back door to Putin. This is his neighborhood. We would regard it as a vital interest. Ukraine for the United States is not a vital interest. And this does give Putin a huge advantage. And I think, if we go back, we can debate, and there are many points of debate. But I would quote George Kennan, who was probably America's most perceptive diplomat scholar of the 20th century, who said the expansion of NATO was one of the great catastrophic mistakes that America made, along with Vietnam. Because if you think about it, the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that Russia became a small-town player, and you could certainly argue that NATO should have, if not disbanded, become a secondary player in European politics. I would even quote Yeltsin. Yeltsin said to the Americans, and I think Yeltsin would go down as the most pro-American president that Russia, Soviet Union ever had. He said, "Stay out of Europe, America. That's all we ask. You leave Europe to us. This is where our geographical boundaries are, and you have no business being a dominant player here." And I think, in a way, Gorbachev is saying exactly the same thing. So it's not just Putin. I think there is tapped a reservoir of a lot of resentment that NATO and America has continued to play the great power game, the bully boy game, if you will, in a neighborhood where it does not have real vital interests at stake.
There's a very long history here, and I mean, we can go back several hundred years, but it seems to me that one of the questions is whether Ukraine is sort of part of Russia or whether it's part of Europe. Now, there's different parts of that history, of course, but I suppose the people of Ukraine have sort of said they want to be part of Europe, not part of Russia.
Well, if you look at the history, the Ukraine has never been part of Russia, Soviet Union, until the Bolshevik Revolution. It was in fact ruled by a condominium of Lithuania and Poland and Russia for much of the 18th, 19th century. So the Ukraine as a territory has not got historical ties to Soviet Union, Russia. The exception, and it's a very important one, is Crimea, because Crimea, in fact, was never part of the Ukraine. It was part of Russia. It was annexed by Catherine the Great in the 18th century, and it was Nikita Khrushchev, the Communist Party leader of the Soviet Union, who handed it over to Ukraine in 1954. But remember, Soviet Union was a centralized dictatorship. The provinces made very little independent decisions, and it was merely a token. It was a token, in fact, because it was the anniversary of some great historical event in the Ukraine, and it was a kind of symbol. So Crimea is a very different story. But certainly Ukraine only became a part of the Soviet Union, of Russia, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1922. So it hasn't a long history of being part of Russia.
How important is the U.S. president and U.S. politics to all of this? And I'm talking specifically around Joe Biden. I mean, he seems to be having a very difficult time domestically at the moment. And in the past, I mean, in American politics, it's been, I hate to be so cynical, but there's some suggestions that some people have felt that a war has helped in terms of domestic politics. But after the withdrawal of Afghanistan, from Afghanistan by the U.S. military, I don't think that dynamic holds.
Now, I think in this case, this is the last thing which Biden wants. He's facing an uphill battle in the U.S. I know certainly American gurus have been, I think, rather unfairly critical of Biden, but he's been given an impossible hand. the COVID virus and the economic dislocation. He's got a Congress which he cannot control. He's only got half of the Senate, so he needs the Kamala Harris casting vote and so on. So he is overrun with domestic problems. And I think what is interesting is, if you ask me the question, why now, I think Biden is part of the answer. I think if Trump was still American president, Putin would not want to endanger what was a fairly healthy relationship from the point of view of personalities. Trump, Putin got on with each other, and I don't think that Putin would have endangered that relationship. But Biden is another story, and of course Biden has a long history of being anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and also I think he's seen as weak. So I think Biden and the weakness of Biden politically has been one of the factors that has encouraged Putin. But from Biden's point of view, his in-tray is already overwhelmed with problems. This is not one that he would seek to capitalize upon, or in fact to have any involvement if he had any choice.
I know this is a strange question, but is the weather a big factor in all of this? And I think it may be a big factor in two ways. The one is that one weapon that Russia has against Europe is that it supplies a lot of gas to Europe. But that only works in winter. And yet to invade a country or to send soldiers into Ukraine in winter is surely harder than it is in summer. Is the weather a factor, the season, in all of this?
I think the weather is a very important factor. And I think that is probably why he has picked winter rather than summer to make these threats. Remember, when you have a big stick and you are not committed to using that big stick, the critical factor is how credible is your threat to use the big stick. In summer, it would have been far less credible. In winter, it does have credibility. But if you actually look, and it's very difficult because these are very emotional issues. People are very emotional, and we have very imperfect information.